Hello GE201. In this video I'm going to go over the first two parts of Chapter 3 North America on the environment and demographic features of that particular region. The U.S. is the third largest consumer of water in the world, behind only the giants China and India, and managing resources of water has done a lot to tell the tale of Western United States history. And the Ogallala Aquifer in the Great Plains has dropped 30 meters in the last 50 years, and it's the largest source of irrigation water for what was the Great American Desert for a long time. North Americans are exposed to water pollution in varied ways because of mining operations, industrial users, or accidental spills like the BP Horizon spill in the Gulf of Mexico in 2011. And metropolitan areas generate vast amounts of raw sewage that has to be treated. And that has really increased the cost of living in many areas to build these plants to purify water. And it's been done in a lot of areas. A lot of hazardous wastes are generated more than in Europe or Western Europe. There are a lot of toxic areas in Texas and Louisiana. That's an understatement. And in the older Northeast, which some of that's been cleaned up because industry is gone out of that part of the United States now. And the Midwest has largely been abandoned also. But there's still problems with what to do with nuclear fuel and chemical warfare storage sites, that, like in Hanford, Washington, that have become toxic. Fertilizers and pesticides also create pollution in the groundwater. Red tide is a phenomenon that happens in Florida periodically. And also, the longer you irrigate the soil, it slowly becomes added with salt or salinization, which is something, it's hard to get that intuitively, but that's what happens because there is a salt content in water. And if you keep putting it into an area where originally it was dry, eventually over the decades and the centuries, the salt builds up in the topsoil. And eventually you're not going to be able to farm in it. Some North American urban areas like Houston and Toronto have islands of heat generated because of all of the activities going on in those cities, and it raises the temperature some 9 to 14 degrees Fahrenheit or 5 to 8 Celsius, and they're much warmer than the surrounding rural areas. Air pollution affects plants, animals, and peoples. Industries, utilities, and automobiles are the main source of atmospheric pollution. Carbon monoxide and other byproducts of driving automobiles is a big source of pollution. Acid rain, when all of the factories were still in North America, was a phenomena, and Toronto was affected by that, and other areas in Ontario, Canada as well. Volcanic eruptions and earthquakes are a problem of the West, especially California. They have real huge earthquakes periodically, every year. Environmental initiatives since the 1970s, the Canada and U.S. have made great strides in improving the water quality of the Great Lakes because of tougher air quality standards. There's not as much air pollution as there was, and that's a function of burning unleaded fuel in automobiles. That's greatly improved the air quality. And many toxic waste sites like Love Canal in Niagara Falls, New York, have been capped. They call it cleaning them up, but all they did was build a huge clay mound and they recovered it again. The second question in population or demography, the main trend of North American history has been urbanization. And there are metropolitan clusters in wide open spaces. If you've ever driven across the United States, most of it is still uninhabited. And Canada has a population density of only 3 people per square kilometer. Many of the statistics that I'm going to quote, ladies and gentlemen, they're a few years old now because it comes from the older textbook. And it might be a little higher than that now, but Canada is largely wide open. And 8% of the population approximately is urban, but most of the population in the United States is urban. The Main Street corridor in Canada is where most people live, led by the cities of Toronto, Montreal, Hamilton, which is just south of Toronto, and the capital of Iowa are within that corridor. The megapolis is one vast city, ladies and gentlemen, on the East Coast from Baltimore to Boston. And these regions make a lot of use of mass transit. Trains are used by these urban populations more so than anywhere else in the United States. Historically, Canada only had 300,000 people in the 1760s, and it's up to over 33 million today. And it's believed as of 2010, the United States has 335 million people. Both Canada and the U.S. have had massive waves of immigration in the 19th and 20th century. In the United States, there was the baby boom that existed from 1946 to, some sociologists say, 1965. Others ended at 1964. Today, the Hispanic group has the largest birth rates, and they will be the majority population by, it's going to be sooner than 2050. It'll probably be in the next decade. How was the area occupied? In 3 stages. There was the European colonial footholds, then the Europeanization of North America, and that led to the Native American groups losing control of their historic lands, and the final expansion of the West, or the Great American Desert as it's sometimes called. And many of these different areas like Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Alberta were largely occupied and populated by white farmers. Mineral rushes. The gold rush is what helped to populate the western United States. The Comstock lode was discovered in Nevada. Vast deposits of silver were discovered there, and also in places like Montana and British Columbia. By the middle of the 20th century, much of North America was domesticated at the expense, as I said, of Native American populations. The European advance forever reshaped North America in the capitalist economy. The New World has been a model reshaping the Old World since the early 20th century. Migration has been westward moving. That is the historic pattern. People are moving west and south. And almost 1 in 5 Americans move annually, usually in search of a higher income or a better quality of life. Las Vegas, Nevada is an example of an area that 60 years ago, compared to today, there was almost nobody there. And this was the fastest growing region in the United States until the economic downturn of 2008. Another phenomenon was the black exodus from the South going up north. Usually during the 2 world wars is when this went on. And since 1970, though, many people have gone back south. 200 years ago, only 5% of Americans lived in urban areas. Today, as mentioned, it's almost 80%. And that's usually, it's a phenomenon of technology, ladies and gentlemen. Mechanization reduced the need for labor on farms, and that led to the decline of the family farm. Corporate farming is largely done in the United States today. The Sun Belt was a huge area of growth since the 1970s. Florida, Texas, Georgia, and North Carolina have been migration destinations within the United States. And Dallas-Fort Worth is larger than Boston, Massachusetts today. The counter-urbanization trend was a phenomenon of mainly the post-World War II period. That was a function of gasoline prices. And today, there is actually people moving back into the cities because of the cost of gasoline. The suburbanization took place when fuel was less expensive and people didn't mind driving because it didn't cost so much. And they might live 50 miles away from where they work. They drive into the city for work and then drive back to the suburbs when the day is over. But many millennials have now actually moved back into urban areas and have revitalized many areas. And if you're interested, here are some of the ways cities have developed using transportation. Gentrification is the term used to describe lower income residents of central neighborhoods being displaced by higher income residents. And that's transformed a lot of different places in the United States. There are still many suburban commuters, but again, that is not, in the last 4 or 5 years, that has been changed by the younger populations. They're not doing that as much. It's too expensive. The automobile greatly changed the pace of life, and it led to the decentralization of cities for a long time. Rural areas are declining as sprawl continues. That is still going on for those who can afford it. And corporate farming has largely replaced the family farm. And many young people have left the former agricultural areas in North America. And that's it for these first 2 areas of Chapter 3.